this sort of allotment Gothic. To me is, what's the rich? I mean, you know what I reckon happiness is? Happiness is sitting in a cabin with rain, and you can hear the rain, delicate pins of rain on the roof, looking through the door with a stovepat in the cabin and watching the damp on some wet dog's fur, on your dog's fur. That's really happiness, with a man with, a waistcoat on who's taking a packet of woodbines out of his waistcoat, looking at an allotment. I don't think I've ever known anything more than that. That really, to me, is beautiful. Very beautiful.
A bunch of flowers. As a child, I didn't like gardens. I was terrified of grubs to start with. Nature, when it was green, was alien to me. Brick walls were my garden. The tarmac street was my lawn. The countryside was like a jungle to me, filled with dangerous things. Any collection of green foliage I would view with suspicion. Any clump of grass, to me, was a possible hiding place for centipedes. My parents didn't know about my feelings about nature, or if they did, they made no account of it. I didn't like tomatoes or bananas either, if it come to that. And the thought of drinking milk was enough to make me heave. It was at this young time of my life that my father used to take me a walk on Sunday mornings. Usually we went across the fields that weren't really the country, because I could see them from my back bedroom window. And anyway, the big lads played football on them. They were just grassed over banks, not really country fields. And each Sunday we would walk across these to where the locomotives pulled the coal wagons, from the pit at the bottom of the bank to the wharf at the top. One of the locos had a brass nameplate with Royal Albert on it. All the coal wagons that Puffers pulled had names on them as well. Victoria, Florence, Sneed, Berry Hill, Chatterley, Whitfield. All the names of the local pits were there, and the names of pits from other coalfields as well. We would stand at the cemetery wall and look down the hill at these blunt-nosed little trains furiously snorting and puffling as they mauled the wagons to the top. I was small at the time and used to sit on the wall to get a better view. This was our usual walk, but one Sunday we went in another direction, toward where I knew the gardens were. On the wall round the gardens, men sat who cursed children and told them to bugger off and play in their own street. But on this day I was with my father, and he knew most of the men by their names, and so they didn't shout at us as we went into the opening in the hedge that led into the paths where the gardens were. This path was so overgrown on both sides with privet hedges that in places it was almost a tunnel. My father threaded his way through, telling me to watch out and not to step in any of the pools of sludge. With some agility I managed to do this as we went a few hundred yards further into this wilderness of codged-up sheds and homemade greenhouses, until my father stopped at a gate and lifted it open. I say lifted it because the gate was hanging askew, and I followed him in with some trepidation, as this garden seemed to me a place very likely filled with scrawling things and grubs. The wet path had been stiffened with old building bricks and bits of stone, flattened and pummeled into the soil, and on each side of the narrow path were rows of growing things. At that time I didn't know one vegetable from another. I wasn't even sure if carrots grew on trees, or that potatoes didn't grow in a bucket at the chip shop. To me, all the different lines of leaves and foliage were much the same. They might all have been just long grass for all I knew, but I did notice that some of the green leaves had pretty flowers growing among them, and to my horror, these flowers were all covered in bees, big dark bees as big as buffaloes, buffaloes, buzzing and bumbling, and worst of all, occasionally flying about the garden and around the path. I at once stiffened with fear, for bees were another one of the wonders of nature that were on my blacklist, and the garden was full of them. If I could have, for shame, I would have run off there and then, but with my father being with me, I couldn't, for shame to show my fear, and by a tremendous effort of will, I trembled myself forward, step by faltering step, deeper into this green hell, toward a hut at the other end of the garden. The hut was made of railway sleepers and sheets of old tin advertisements, one of which was facing outwards. It read, "Mellock's Marvels," in white letters on a blue ground. The lettering was disfigured by a rash of rust spots. The roof of the shed was made of tin corrugated sheets, and out of one of these sheets a little tin chimney jutted, bellowing smoke. As he got near the door, my father shouted, "At in, Elijah!" At once an old man appeared in the doorway. Elijah Mumford was tall and thin and emaciated like a rotten drain-pipe. His skin was the colour of stewed tea, and he had big, awkward feet and a cap on back to front. He was dressed in pigmeal sacks tied with a rope round his waist, and a pipe was stuck in his mouth. He pulled this out and grinned as he saw my father. "Well, I'll go to hell. They's come say me then, hast?" "I thought I'd come look at you," me father answered. "Is that the lad?" Elijah indicated toward me. My father nodded, and I stared up at the old man. He then put his pipe back in his mouth, and I noticed the black stem of his pipe had been sucked so hard and so long that it had turned a milky grey colour. He puffed at it and then suddenly pulled it out and licked around the inside of his mouth as though clearing something from his teeth, and then he spat into a tub of slimy green water by the door of the hut. "What's the name, lad?" he asked me, looking me up and down. I stood dumbstruck by this question and didn't answer at first. "Tell him the name," my father said, and I nervously muttered, "Arthur." "Arthur, eh? 2 Arthurs, eh?" he laughed. As he said this, a little dog rushed down the path and jumped up at the old man, who pushed it away. "Where's they been, you little bugger? Has been out all right? There's a bitch on heat in our straight." "Get down!" He pushed the dog away. "They're a bloody nuisance, bitches are." "Well, are you coming in, me little eyes?" he said, and turned to go in the shed. My father followed him, and I followed behind. The shed was hardly big enough to hold the 3 of us. "I call it Buckingham Palace. It's me second home," he said, lowering himself into an old armchair, against which was a little coke stove with a narrow pipe up to the roof. The dog at once jumped on his knee and he began to stroke it. And then, suddenly, he pushed the dog off his knee and got a round tin box from his pocket, opened it, pulled out a little pigtail of black twist and began to cut it with a bone-hafted knife with a long hooked blade. "When come say if you got anything give away," me father said, smiling at him. "Well, they's come to the right bloody shop then, mate," the old man laughed, rubbing the twist between the palms of his big dry hands. "I'm ready for the work as any day. What with the price of ale and back of these days, I'm skint by Tuesday, pension's nout. Hast heard about Pigwash?" "Pigwash?" My father repeated the name wonderingly. "Pigwash? Who's he?" "Ernie Blacktop. Him as used work in the South Hard mine. Him as won all that money. Well, it hadn't done him much good. They found him dead in bed as Sunday morning. They tell me I drunk 20 pints and 10 rums the night before." The old man pressed the twist into his pipe with his thumb. "The gutsy bugger deserved I after drinking that." The old man shook his head. "Who'd ever thought it? The conversation continued in this fashion. Elijah, the old man, used to work with my father at the pit, and as they went on about old times, speaking about men I didn't know, I got bored and sat on the step of the shed and stroked the dog. And then I noticed the old man's clogs. I had never seen clogs like them before. They were wicked-looking things that had snouts like animals, long and creased and dry. The wooden soles had no tips and were split in places and had been worn almost flat. Both were tied with a new piece of hairy string. Above the top of the clogs I could see a bit of his white leg before his trousers began. The legs were thin and hairless, and on one of his trouser knees the corduroy had split, and another sliver of white leg showed. But as he sat back in the old chair, he stretched his legs out and sucked deep on his pipe. I thought I'd never seen a man in such comfort before. "I come down here when it turns me height," he said, and with a movement of one of his feet he opened the front of the stove, and the heat at once filled the little hut. "What's think about that, eh? It burns nowt but cinders." He then tapped the door of the stove shut again and mauled himself up, and for a second the genial look on his face turned sour. "Women of the ruination, the best of the bad uns. When I first met my lady I could eaten her, and now I wish I had a done. A man's better off on his own any day." He almost spat this sentence out, and then his face lit up again. "Come on, I'll show thee the garden," he said. And as he stepped past me to get out of the shed, he put his hand on the top of my head. "Come on, me little mon. So they't an Arthur at?" He stuck his bottom jaw out and sucked his cheeks in and looked down at me. "Well, come on then, you two Arthurs, and look at me garden." He began to walk down the path toward the gate with my father behind him and me at the back, and in single file we walked slowly forward, once more among the dreaded foliage where all the bees and crawlers were. And soon I felt that the insects were in my hair or crawling up my leg, and a panic began to rise in me again. But the two men in front were oblivious of this. "Just look at these." The old man bent down, lifted some leaves to show my father something underneath. Then he moved on to a bed of coloured flowers and began to pluck some. When he had chosen a few, he straightened himself up again. "Tak no advice, and leave women alone, lad. They're false. Oh, on 'em false." I wasn't sure what he was talking about. Women only figured in my life as my mother and my grandmother, or aunts at that time. "I hide every penny," he went on. "If her laid her hands on it, it'd all soon be gone. Elsie, my eldest daughter's just the same. It's have all the time with them. If there's one pair of shoes is 30, they must buy a pair every week. Why should I be in the workus if it was left to her?" As he said this, he came to a bed of red flowers with leaves like velvet, and he put 2 fingers under the head of one of the flowers and very carefully lifted it up and cut the stem with his penknife and carefully arranged this flower among the others he was carrying. "They're on about having a new thrice sweet on the Never Never, huh? Has only just finished being for the last bugger." He was by now almost talking to himself as we followed him, and I could just make out from his chunter, "Never let 'em know what you'n got, lad, or it's our. Never turn her up. I've told all my lads when they married, never turn her up. Women'll have her every penny, and think no better on you for it. They'll spend every penny on rubbish. They can say my missus coming. There's no more sense than a 16-year-old wench." I had no idea what he was on about, as my mind was much occupied with bees and grubs. Every time I put my foot down, I watched to see if a grub had crawled under it, and the thought of squashing one under my foot was so revolting to me that my mind almost retched with the thought of it. All I wanted to do was to get out of the garden and run as fast as I could to where the solid pavements were. But my father kept on talking, kept on asking the old man questions about this vegetable or that, and as we got to the gate, he stood looking down back at the garden, and to my distress they began to walk back down the path again, talking all the time. It seemed to me they'd never stop. One second my father would begin to move as though he intended coming out, and then he'd stop again, and the talk would go on. I stood waiting by the gate and could hear the old man railing on about his wife. "The face as red as a turkey cock when they come in. They'd been on shorts all night. Here and there either. Her's buried 2 husbands. Her has. Ailing are good enough for her. It's got to be shorts. Her last husband left her a bit of money. When they thinks a bloke works his guts out for a lifetime for save a few quid, and 5 minutes after he's gone they begin spending it, it's cruel, mon. He had now come back to stand by the gate, and as my father was saying so long to him, he suddenly looked at the bunch of flowers he was holding in his hand, and beckoned me to him, and bent down and gave them to me. "Here you are, young man, take these to thee mother, and tell her put them in some waiter," he said. And then he stood up painfully to his full height, and slowly turned, and with a wave of his hand began to walk down the path toward the little hut that was his second home.